most people actually don't know what a GMO is.
You asked probably 10 people.
Yeah, they're like, I don't know, I just know they're bad. That's the answer you often get. What we accomplish with GMOs, for example, the huge reduction in insecticide use globally as a result of the adoption of BT crops, actually aligns with most people's values. Most people want to see us produce more food with less inputs. Well, that kind of fits that model.
Welcome to Clear Conversations. We are thrilled to have you with us today, and we are truly honored to have our guest with us today. Her name is Alison Van Eenennaam. She is a distinguished professor of cooperative extension in the field of animal genomics and biotechnology in the Department of Animal Science here at UC Davis. Thank you for being here with us, Alison.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Well, so we have to start out. It is a little bittersweet in the sense we are so honored to have you with us today, but you're retiring. So today is actually one of your last days here at UC Davis.
That is correct. It's my last day.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for joining us, and congratulations. Have you even had time to reflect on your career, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a busy time, but I think I must say that I can't underemphasize the importance that serendipity and good luck has kind of had on my career. So I came over to UC Davis as an undergraduate on exchange, the Education Abroad program, and I met a new professor at the time, Dr. Juan Medrano. It was his first year teaching, and I did his genetics class. And that was where he said, you know what, you should come and do a graduate degree at UC Davis. And I had never thought of doing that before. And so that really started me on the path to doing my graduate degrees here and ultimately ending up as on faculty here for the last 25 years or so. And so that was just, lucky coincidence at the time.
Serendipitous, as they say, like you said.
Yeah.
So what was it about genetics that you loved or that attracted you to it? What was it that you loved about it?
Well, I think I originally kind of got into agricultural science as a result of the famines in the 70s, growing up as a kid in Australia, that they were always featuring that. And at the time, there was work being done by Norman Borlaug to basically the Green Revolution, genetics and breeding in plants is such an important aspect of food production, and I wanted to be involved in it, and also was interested in animals. And it's like, wow, I wonder if there's like a Norman Borlaug-y animal genetics thing that could be a thing. So it really was the food security aspect of it that interests me. And then I grew up with horses, and so I was just interested in animal genetics, and so I was fortunate to be able to merge those two interests together in my career.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit too about, we hear of these terms, biotechnology and gene editing and genomic, tell us the differences and tell us how they relate. I know it's big, but how they, and how they relate in animal agriculture.
Yeah, so that's a really big topic.
Yes.
And so I think, biotechnology is biology and technology. So technology applied to biology, well, that's farming, right? Is that not farming?
Right.
So I think that every farmer can relate to the fact that they are biotechnologists, but often that term is used to mean modern biotechnologies. So maybe older biotechnologies might be things like artificial insemination. Modern biotechnologies has more commonly referred to actually altering the genomes of animals to introduce useful characteristics. And perhaps the most prominent and well-known of that is genetic engineering, or GMOs as they get called in the public. But a genetically modified organism, what does that actually mean? Is not a chihuahua a genetically modified organism? And so I don't like that term because it's not very precise, and it can mean just conventional breeding. But I like to use genetic engineering, which historically has involved introducing a trait or a characteristic from a different species. Like, for example, BT cotton is resistant to insects because it expresses a protein from a bacteria that makes basically caterpillars die if they eat it. That's different to gene editing, which is actually tweaking the DNA within an organism, typically without any involvement of DNA from another organism, like I gave the example earlier. And to me, it's very analogous to conventional breeding. So the reason we have selected our dairy cattle populations and our beef cattle populations is selection on naturally occurring DNA variations in the genome. That's why a Holstein doesn't look like an Angus animal, because breeders said, hey, I want this productive female for my dairy, and the beef guy said, hey, I want this muscular looking, male for my beef, and they selected them in. And so basically gene editing replicates or mimics what you can do with conventional breeding, but in a very targeted way. So you can introduce a useful characteristic like disease resistance into elite germplasm and give very productive pigs or cattle the ability to resist disease without diluting all of the excellence being brought in through the breeding programs. And that's hugely important for animal agriculture, to be able to have the most efficient and productive breeding lines and be able to introduce useful traits on top of that. And so those all come together in some way. They're all related to each other, but some get a free pass in terms of public comment. I haven't heard too many people be upset about genomic selection, for example, which is basically using all the genomic information to make the most accurate decision as to which animals should be parents of the next generation. Whereas, of course, there's a lot of discourse around things like GMOs and Frankenfish and those kind of emotive terms that tend to get you a little bit upset and concerned about life.
Right, and they're meant to get you upset,
well,
right?
They're intended, I think so.
Right.
Yeah, Frankenfish doesn't have a nice ring to it, does it?
No. So, you must have seen this change tremendously in the time that you've been doing it here at UC Davis. So the terms and the terminology in genetics. What has surprised you, or what is the biggest change you've seen in the realm of genetics?
Well, I did my degree here, and then I went and worked at, during my PhD, I did an internship at Celgene here, which was a small biotech startup at the time. That was basically a bunch of university professors here started it. And that was right when they released the Flavor Saver tomato, or tomato, if I'm being American. So basically that was a tomato that had a longest shelf life. And it was released whilst I was an intern there. And to much excitement. Like, there was an old supermarket here at Davis called State Market, and they used to feature these tomatoes, and they actually had a limit on how many you could buy because all of the science nerds at Davis were like, oh yeah, we want to get our hands on that. And so it was brought out without any kind of pushback or opposition. And similarly, at the same kind of time, this is maybe about 30 years ago, the disease-resistant papaya was released in Hawaii, which saved that papaya industry. And at that time, there wasn't really an organized opposition to GMOs. And what's been interesting to me is watching what I consider as a really useful technology to introduce useful traits into our breeding programs get kind of demonized. And the narrative around it now is so out of touch with what the science says. And it's just been really hard to counter that narrative because fear sells. And reassuring science is kind of boring. And I think that's been very frustrating to see that we haven't been able to use this technology in our breeding programs in animals. Of course, there's millions of farmers growing genetically engineered crops around the world, but we really haven't brought anything to market that's genetically engineered animals other than the Aqua Advantage salmon, which was approved, but that company has gone bankrupt now. So yeah, not a great story, to be honest, but that's what happened. Yeah.
So how do you combat that misinformation? You were part of a really extraordinary documentary, The Food Evolution, and you're not afraid to get in there. I have to give you credit, Alison. You got in there with some folks, and you really kind of, went up to people on the streets that had non-GMO signs and spoke with them and tried to offer the scientific dialogue to them, just to, offer the science to them and see what they thought about it. How do you do that? How do you combat misinformation and be strong enough to get out there to communicate the science to folks?
I think most people actually don't know what a GMO is. They've heard they're bad, but they're not really sure why.
Right. And if you ask probably 10 people,
they're like, I don't know, I just know they're bad. That's the answer you often get.
Yeah.
And it is a complicated topic, but actually I think if you actually get down to it, what we accomplish with GMOs, for example, the huge reduction in insecticide use globally as a result of the adoption of BT crops, actually aligns with most people's values. Like, most people want to see us produce more food with less inputs. Well, that kind of fits that model. And if you actually speak to people about what is it that concerns you, it's often concerns around multinational companies and particularly Monsanto. But that kind of fear of, corporate domination of the food supply is often more what people are worried about than actually the genetics and the science behind GMOs. And I think, some of the applications that we're using these technologies for, like disease resistance in the papaya, it's kind of hard to argue against. Like, why would you want an animal or a plant that can get sick when we have a genetic solution to that problem, and we can actually have animals and plants that don't get sick? And just having that discussion, often you find there's shared values under there, and that the narrative is really being driven by more of this anti-corporate kind of sentiment, and often getting flamed, to be honest, by competing business interests that will very happy to sell you something that doesn't contain this scary thing that they've just made you be scared of, and maybe a little bit of additional cost if it's got a butterfly on it. But it's really kind of a bit of a sneaky marketing strategy to try to encourage people to go buy their products and be scared of the products produced using genetic engineering. And it's a shame to me, because I think most people would actually prefer to use technologies that reduce insecticide use, that prevent disease. It actually does reduce the use of inputs in our production systems, and that narrative is kind of missing. The counterfactual of, okay, yeah, we could not have BT plants. Well, in conventional ag, then they're probably going to get sprayed with insecticides, which is probably not ideal. And so animals getting sick is better not to get sick. So those are the kind of trade-offs, I think, that aren't often implicit or obvious when people say, oh yeah, I just buy non-GMO or organic. It's like, well, that's a choice, but understand that there's a trade-off and an opportunity cost associated with not allowing safe innovations into our food systems.
Yeah. It's hard. We talk a lot about it on the podcast, communicating science, how difficult that is sometimes to make it digestible to folks. But you found ways, and you found ways that work. What are some thoughts on communicating science? How do you do it so well, Alison?
Well, I've been in this field a long time, and this is pretty controversial, like GMOs. Yeah. And then, I'm in animal agriculture too, and I didn't imagine when I was first getting into agricultural science that genetics and cows would become super controversial topics, right? I'm like, everybody likes agricultural scientists and feeding people, right? I thought that was a pretty safe career choice, but it's ended up being quite controversial, I think. And that's been something that you need to try and counter. And I think, Cooperative Extension, which is part of the land grant mission in the United States, was set up to take science from the university to farmers. That was kind of the historical foundation, when 98% of our population were agricultural. Well, that's changed now. It's like 98% in urban areas and 2% working in agriculture. And I think that Cooperative Extension has to keep up with that. And rather than taking science to farmers, I actually think our role is partly to take science to the public to explain why agriculture is doing what it does. Because in the absence of understanding why, for example, you might want a disease-resistant pig, if you don't know that there's a disease called PRRS, for example, porcine reproductive respiratory syndrome, that is really devastating the pig industry, you might not understand the importance of having disease resistance to that. And so I actually think we need to do more public outreach, and we're not often trained in that. We're often trained as scientists. We kind of have how we present our information. Start with your hypothesis and your methods and your materials and conclusions, and then we need more funding to do more research, right? You don't, and it's like you flip that pyramid when you're doing public outreach. You start with the why rather than the how, and the kind of the so what aspect of it, and the emotive aspect. Like as a parent, why should I care about what you're doing? And I think as a citizen of this world, geneticists are a really important part of sustainability. And I think if you look at the genetic improvement in our plants and animals, it has absolutely contributed to lowering the environmental footprint of food production, and minimizing the amount of land we need to grow our food, and sparing that land for other purposes. And that is a story that is often not known, because geneticists aren't out there, kind of doing their jazz hands saying, hey, look at us, look at the amazing improvements we've made. Right. But it's actually just a core component of sustainability. Yeah. And whenever you tie geneticists' hands behind their back by saying, oh, no, can't use that technology, you've got to understand that there's a cost associated with that, and that opportunity cost of not being allowed to use technologies is not really well elaborated, I think, and is an important thing that should be part of people's metrics when they're making decisions around, well, am I going to support this production system? Is it efficient? And actually, does it align with my values of reduced environmental footprint? Because often I think there's certain production systems that get kind of an aura of sustainability that actually aren't very efficient. And actually, there's a real kind of contraindication there in terms of, okay, if you buy that, you're actually buying, you're increasing the carbon footprint of your food production choices, which is fine, but own it. I find it sometimes a little bit weird when people, drive up to, I don't know, Whole Foods in a Prius, because I'm like, okay, I'm getting mixed messages here. The cognitive dissonance is pretty real, and I think most people don't understand ag production, and so they don't even realize that what they're being told is the most sustainable system, if you actually look at the metrics, depending what metric you want to use, is actually quite a higher footprint, and you may actually be making a choice that's counter to your actual core belief system without understanding the kind of the trade-offs associated with not allowing the useful technologies in our ag production systems.
Yeah. And speaking of genetics and efficiency and sustainability, that's a big topic of our State of the Science Summit that you were part of last year. And then this year we had a whole panel on genetics as well, and they said genetics do work. Genetics, that was the big takeaway, was genetics do work.
Hello. Like telling a geneticist.
Right. So how would they work for reducing methane in animal agriculture and sustainability? How would they fit into the whole equation, I should say?
So I think generally genetics has contributed to reducing what I call the emissions intensity.
Yes.
And so if we just look at conventional selection, so no genetic engineering, just conventional selection on naturally occurring mutations and using genomic selection to enhance all of that, that has basically contributed, for example, in the dairy industry, to reducing the carbon footprint of a glass of milk to about a third of what it was in the 1950s. And that's as a result of the fact, quite frankly, that cows now produce about 4 times as much milk as they did in the 1950s. So how are they able to do that? Well, it's a combination of feed and medical care, but also genetics is a pretty big component of that. So that's its really big play. I think there's potentially some opportunity to do some selection on animals that have reduced emissions, but I actually think the biggest thing we can contribute to is maintaining the selection for the more efficient animals in general, ones that don't get sick, that have longevity, that are well suited to their production environment, that produce a calf every year. They tick all the boxes. That is how we can best reduce emissions, because basically a productive animal is going to have a reduced emissions per unit of milk or meat or whatever as compared to a non-productive animal. And so it's kind of a boring answer, because it's like, just keep doing what we're doing, but don't underestimate how effective that has really been. Right. And if you look at, in countries like the US and Europe, where we have very productive systems, we're not increasing animal numbers to address our demand for meat and milk products, animal source products. Where we see that demand increasing and animal numbers increasing is in the developing world, where they haven't yet adopted some of these well-known safe innovations, like even artificial insemination, or even performance recording and getting genetic merit estimates on animals to make sure you're selecting the best bulls and the best cows to produce offspring for the next generation. And so to me, that's really where the need is to, and it's extension. It's really, we need more extension in the developing world to adopt safe technologies that have been very, good return on investment to producers in the first world, but haven't really taken off in some of the developing worlds where the need is and where animal numbers are increasing. And that, to me, is really the challenge that we have moving forward. Yeah,
absolutely. We've talked about your research, some of your research. One of the most famous research projects you were a part of was with Cosmo the calf. Mm-hmm. Who is Cosmo?
So Cosmo was a bull calf, and he was a research project of one of my PhD students. Joey Owen was his name. And basically we were trying to introduce a gene called SRY, that's the sex-determining region on the Y chromosome, which takes a an individual inheriting a Y chromosome down the male differentiation pathway. So when you're born, your gonad can go either way, and if you get SRY, it takes you down the male development pathway, and if you don't, then you go down the female development pathway. That's in mammals. And so what we hypothesized, if we moved that gene onto a non-sex chromosome, that's called an autosome, then that bull, he's XY himself, but he will always, so half of his offspring will get the Y chromosome, but then the other half will get X chromosome, but if they inherit the autosome that has the SRY on it, then half of those would be expected to appear male, be phenotypically male. They wouldn't be fertile, but they would be male. And that would give you 3/4 male, 1/4 female, which in beef production systems is kind of what you want. You want about 25% coming back as replacement heifers, and then 3/4 go to the feedlot to get finished, and males are more efficient in the feedlot. They convert feed to gain more quickly. They're more fuel efficient, if you want to look at it that way, and are the preferred sex in the feedlot. And so we were doing this crazy idea to introduce that gene in the embryo and then transfer that embryo through embryo transfer to produce a calf. And we were actually able to get it knocked in. To do that, we put a fluorescent marker on it, a green fluorescent protein, so that we could visualize the embryo, the blastocyst it's called, which is kind of the developing embryo, before we transferred it, and only transfer the ones that were green. And so we did that, and we had multiple failures, like years of failures, and finally we got this one pregnancy, and it was like, we were like, oh my gosh, please be a boy, please be a boy. It was a boy, yay. And then he was gestating, and it's 9 months, same as humans, for the pregnancy. 2020, ring a bell? Wow. Yeah, wow. COVID. So he was due during COVID, and he was late arriving. And so we were talking to the vets, and we're like, do we need to induce? Well, guess what? There was a real demand on the veterinary materials that we would need to do a cesarean section. So they were all getting used in the hospitals for people that were getting intubated. And so there was a real shortage of that. And we're like, oh, I don't know that we can get any kind of anesthetics in order to do a C-section. And so anyway, we ended up delivering him safely, and he kind of plopped out onto the ground and took his first breath, and he was alive and well, and it was a really special day. And then because he had the green fluorescent protein, as part of the construct that we had used to produce him, in addition to the SRY gene, and when we didn't know when he was born that he in fact was, we just knew he was green, and so that the graduate student went and took some DNA, and then there was a very tense, couple of hours, and I never forget the phone call. He's like, I am happy to say we have the first knocked-in bovine, because he obviously confirmed that, so that was really good. But I was curious if he expressed the green fluorescent protein. So he's a black calf. He looked kind of like an Angus. But if you have an animal that expresses that, then you often will see it in the pink of their nose and in the white of their hooves. And he had 2 little white hooves at the back. And so I was like, well, how can I've got to excite the green fluorescent protein. It's not an autofluorescent, you've got to excite it. And you need, it's kind of like, ever been in a disco? I'm probably aging myself there, right? But if you go in a disco and you kind of get that fluorescence, you need that UV light. And so I had a UV light at home because we have a tank of glowfish. So I brought the UV light in, and I'm like, where's a dark place in the feedlot here? This is the actual feedlot. And the only place I could come up with was the toilet down the end. And so we
the glamorous life of
we walked him
geneticist.
into the toilet, and we closed the door and made it really dark and shined the UV onto his feet to see if they would glow green. But they kind of autofluoresced, and so it was really hard to tell if it was actually the green fluorescence or just the autofluorescence that would normally happen when you have a calf in a toilet with white feet. I don't know. We didn't have a control calf to run down there and do the same too. But anyway, that was a bit of fun. But he grew up, and he unfortunately produced some XX SRY positive offspring who were female, because that's science. And so we think there was maybe the gene didn't get expressed or something, and so it didn't actually make his XX SRY offspring male. But that's science, unfortunately.
Science. But, you win some, you lose some.
You win some, you lose some,
But So I have to say, what are you going to miss about all this too? Because you just light up when you talk about your research and something like that. That was like success. We find, because with science you do kind of fail a lot, or you fail and you learn and you get better at it. But I mean, you've done so much, and is there something you're going to miss about this research?
I mean, I enjoy like not knowing the outcome of research. When you've got the pregnancies in utero, and we still do quite a lot of gene editing work with sheep, quite often with sheep now.
Yes.
And just the kind of excitement of what's it going to be, and maybe it's going to go my way this time, and you never know. And I think that's an important aspect of science is. A lot of it is failure, and we're pretty open about how long it took us to get Cosmo. I've got a little video on my website because I think it's often you'll see movies and it's like, I don't know, The Martian or something, and everything works, right? And it's like, that's not how it works. Most of the time it's actually not that interesting. It's just like kind of routine stuff. And so when you do get a win and you see a student whose project that they've been working on for 6 years is finally successful, it's really a very a fun time.
Takes a lot of patience.
There is a lot of patience.
Yeah.
But it makes victories so much sweeter.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so where do you see this field of genetics going? Like, if you had a magic wand in 20 years, what would you like to see or hear maybe from folks?
Well, I mean, I think I alluded to earlier that there's actually some well understood technologies that really haven't been taken up much in some of the developing world. And so I would love to see more adoption of known techniques, just basically using better animals, more efficient animals as the sire and dam of the next generation. And that, I think, is something that will require a lot of extension efforts. And I think we've seen the adoption of things like genomic selection really take off in the dairy and beef industry in the United States. So that's, again, the 50,000 SNP chips, so 50,000 markers in the genome. You can analyze an animal when it's born and get what's called a genomic merit prediction from that DNA. So basically looking at what an animal inherited from its mum and its dad. I don't know if you have siblings, but if you have siblings, you know that you're not all the same. And that some of you got the good genes for, I don't know, the smarts, and some got the good genes for sports, and then usually the third one has they're the joker of the family. There's a certain birth order aspect to that.
Yes.
But that's just because you got different alleles or variants of genes from your mum and dad. And so there's going to be some animals that just get lucky and got really good alleles or variants of genes from mum and dad for milk, reproduction, fertility, and others that just get unlucky and they're the worst. And you can say, oh, hello, young calf that just got born. You're going to be a star because you got everything perfect from your mum and dad, and I'm going to use you to be the sire of the next generation. That's what genomic selection does, and that has doubled the rate of genetic improvement in the dairy industry in the United States since it was introduced in 2009. Doubled. And now it gets combined with the ability to identify the best heifers and produce with sex semen only female calves to be replacements, and then use the rest of the dairy herd. So you just basically replacements are about 30% of the dairy herd. You can use the other 70% of the dairy herd to produce beef animals, and basically reduce the environmental footprint of the beef industry, because you're getting quote unquote free calves from the dairy industry, which otherwise would have been producing unwanted dairy bulls, which can't milk a bull. And so ideally, if you get a nice beef animal getting born to the genetic low end of the dairy herd, you kind of improve the efficiencies of both industries simultaneously by using innovations in genetics. And it's that kind of, applications of these technologies that are so important, and they have such big knock-on effects in terms of the reducing the environmental footprint of our food production systems. And it's a beautiful story, and it's used a lot here in the dairy industry in California, and it's really a technology that producers adopted because they get more for the beef calves, and then it's just kind of a win-win technology for everybody, and it's not often you get technologies like that come along and that have such a profound impact on, I heard something like 30% of our beef calves now are coming from the dairy industry. And so, it's really widespread, and it is enabled by the use of these innovative technologies.
Wow. Wow. And so, as far as research goes, is there a project besides Cosmo? Was there something that you're particularly proud of as you look back at your time here at UC Davis? Something that you, or a student, or a story, or something that you fondly look back upon and think, oh, that was a good time,
Uh,
or I'm proud of that.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some wonderful students over the years, and I'm proud of all of them. Most of them have gone into industry, which I'm also quite proud of.
Yeah.
I think I had one that failed and went into academia, but she's a professor now at Kansas State University, Macy Mueller. And so we had some gene-edited calves she produced. We were inactivating a gene that contributes to germ cell development, so they were intentionally infertile for a different project. But that was exciting, again, having pregnancies, again, during COVID. And so, yeah, trying to make all that happen. But actually, the very first project I did when I got here, so I'd come from Calgene, which was obviously a biotech company for plants. And my idea was to introduce basically the gene that makes omega-3 fatty acids into dairy cows to make high omega-3 milk, so heart-healthy milk or brain-healthy milk. So you eat salmon for the omega-3s, and basically dairy cattle, all the microbes in their gut break down those saturated fats into unsaturated fats. So this was a way in the mammary gland to express this protein to make them polyunsaturated omega-3 fatty acids. And we actually did that in mice. So we expressed this gene in their mammary gland, and then we had this little tiny milking machine. it was like a pipette tip attached to the house vacuum, and we were milking these mice because they have several teats on each side to get like one drop of milk that we could analyze with the NIR, I think it was. Anyway, we expressed it and we got high omega-3 milk in these mice, which obviously aren't cows. And so that was super exciting. And so then I wrote a grant to the USDA, who funds agricultural research in the United States. And I said, hey, I have this idea to make omega-3 milk in cows, and it would be a consumer product, because we kept hearing there's got to be some benefit to the consumer for genetic engineering and GMOs. That'll help with public acceptance. And I also did think that it's a human health aspect. And so the exciting was when we got the mice and it worked. The not so fun side of this story was that actually the review was like, this is really good science, but we can't fund it because the public will never accept GMOs. And I'm like, well, I guess not if they never have a product that they want. And actually, this was back in the early 2000s, a little bit after that, there was written into the public funding calls that they would not fund genetic engineering projects in food animals in the United States. And for about 15 years, I actually couldn't do the research that I wanted to do and was trained to do because there was no ability to get research funding for genetic engineering due to the misinformation around this technology. And it's like you don't think that public perception can really have a big impact on your career and your research topics, but it really did. And then when genome editing came along with CRISPR-Cas9 and the discovery of the ability to make these tweaks in the genome, then the funding opened up again, and I had to take basically a 15-year hiatus from working on molecular genetics and kind of working on altering the genome of animals because of this, and then could start up again once CRISPR came along and the kind of the ability to not introduce foreign DNA, and because we figured that was going to have a different kind of public acceptance relative to traditional genetic engineering. And we're not large multinational company. I'm an academic scientist, so there was some hope that there would be a little bit more acceptance of things like disease resistance that have been introduced by just tweaking a naturally occurring gene in an animal and making it a resistant variety or a resistant allele. So yeah, looking back, when you asked me to reflect, that decision really had a very big impact on what I could do. And luckily, I guess, at that time was when the first genetic markers were coming on the market, getting sold to producers. And that was a really important, but not very sexy part of my career, was, there were companies out there selling like single gene tests for quantitative traits like marbling. and there's not really a gene for marbling. There's like, there are single genes for like blue eyes, brown eyes, but for a trait like marbling, it's, quantitative. There's thousands of different alleles that contribute to whether an animal is highly marbled or not. And my spidey senses went, hang on, a single gene test for a quantitative trait? That doesn't make sense. And so there was a group of us that got together, the National Beef Evaluation Consortium, to really validate, well, what are these markers actually predictive of marbling, and what percentage of the genetic variation do they account for? Because if producers are making selection decisions based on a single marker test, whether an animal's AA or big A or little a, that's a decadal long decision. And it has to be based on just bulletproof science for you to trust it, or else they might be selecting the wrong animal. If in fact there's no correlation between big A at this allele and the particular characteristic they're looking at. And so there was quite a period of time there, and actually I think my most cited paper is the validation of commercial tests for beef cattle production, because it was getting oversold, and I think that's an important role that Extension has played historically, is providing objective, independent evidence for whatever is getting sold, whether it's a variety of corn or it's a genetic test. And so that came along, and so I kind of segued into that. So not so much producing gene altered animals, but actually working on the extension aspects and how to incorporate the DNA information into our genetic evaluation programs. And during the course of my career, we went from single gene tests to now the 50,000 SNP test, which gets integrated into the national genetic evaluations, such that we get what's called genomically enhanced EPDs, or expected progeny differences, which is the beef cattle term for genetic merit indicators. And so that's happened during my life. I was born in 1963, I can say that. That was like 10 years after DNA was actually published, right? The double helix paper was 1953, Watson and Crick. And recombinant DNA didn't come along till, I think, round about the time that I was finishing my bachelor's. And so there was no concept of being a biotechnology specialist in my career when I was going through my undergraduate, because the field didn't even exist. And so I feel like the technologies are kind of growing up along with me, alongside me. And I couldn't have envisioned when I was an undergraduate that we would have 50 SNP chips done now on tens of millions of dairy animals, and it's doubled the rate of genetic progress in dairy selection globally. In the same way, I couldn't imagine that I have a cell phone that's more powerful than the computers back in the back in the 60s. And so I think the genomics field has really taken off, and it's just really satisfying to see it getting used in the industry to actually make informed selection decisions, and actually translating it from this nerdy conceptual thing of SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Well, how can you make that useful to producers? Well, you basically work out which SNPs are associated with traits of interest, and then you can test the animal and say, oh my gosh, you got the best 50K SNP profile ever, you lucky thing. You're going to be the best bull in the breed, I can tell right now, and so I'm going to make sure I amplify your contribution through artificial insemination. That's kind of how it works.
Well, so I asked you what you were, reflecting back on your research, reflecting back on your communication and your extension. Is there any moment or anything that stands out that you can reflect on and think, oh yeah, that was pretty cool, that was special?
Well, so I have tried to do some public outreach in some perhaps non-traditional places. So I did participate in the Dr. Oz show, and that was basically about 3 weeks before Proposition 37 went through in California, which was the proposition to mandate the labeling of all food that were derived from genetically engineered or GMO plants. And so that was quite frightening. So I had to go over to New York City to do the filming. And so I was on there, and I was paired with I traveled actually with a colleague here from UC Davis, Martina McLaughlin, who also works in this field. And the other guests that Dr. Oz had on were people, particularly Jeffrey Smith, who has literally no expertise in this field, but is very outspoken about the dangers of it. I think his training is as a ballroom dancer, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, and that was, it was uncomfortable, I guess, but I did get to say that I thought this technology was safe, and I don't think that got edited out. But that my concern was that by mandating labeling on all products, you're basically putting a very high labeling cost on every product in the supermarket in California, and there's really no concomitant public health benefit. There's literally no data that there's any public health concerns with the genetically engineered products on the market. And it really was because of and it's hard to argue against the consumer right to know. But the thing is that why does the consumer want to know this if there's no public health concerns associated with it? And there's that, typically if consumers want to buy particular production attributes like grass-fed, that's a voluntary program that producers that provide grass-fed opt into, and then they package it and keep it segregated. And that whole segregation in the supply chain falls on that value-added product. Organic is another example like that. And that's voluntary. It's got nothing to do with health. It's just, I like to buy whatever. And that option's in the marketplace right now. What I was concerned about and remain concerned about is mandating labeling costs on the whole conventional supply chain raises the costs for conventional consumers who maybe are not worried about that. But now you've got that mandate on it, and that was really what the discussion was about. Of course, since then, it became a national initiative, and now the bioengineering label is on products that come from genetically engineered crops. And did consumer behavior change at all? Not one drop. The label went on and people kept buying what they were buying. And so I think that it's often overblown, the impact that actually the labels have. But it's also a more a philosophical thing, because I might, I don't know, not want to have milk from cows that were artificially inseminated. I don't know, that's just my position. Well, imagine trying to keep milk segregated for that. And it's like, why do you want to know that? It's my right to know. But you don't actually have a right to know everything in the marketplace if there's such very expensive segregation, supply chain segregation that happens. And I think people maybe don't often think about that. And they're like, well, I'd just rather nobody used artificial insemination. Well, let's just imagine, again, to that opportunity cost, imagine if we hadn't adopted AI in the 1940s, artificial insemination, not artificial intelligence, in the 40s, and those cows weren't producing 4 times as much milk as they are now, we would have probably 4 times as many cows to produce the same amount of milk. And that is a choice, sure, but is it actually the best choice for the environment? And that's the kind of trade-offs that I really like to talk about, because I just think most people don't understand why we're using technology in our agricultural production systems and the benefit that that brings to not only the farmer, but also more generally the environment and the consumer, to be honest, because it does keep costs down.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as we kind of end this, I do have to ask, what advice would you give for young researchers and young scientists coming up in this field? What advice would you offer to them?
I wouldn't start off on the Dr. Oz show.
Okay. One pro tip, don't do that.
Well,
wait a while.
In part because I think it's important to establish your credibility as a scientist. And so, we have a lot of influencers now who just get influential because they take pretty pictures on Instagram or something. But science has a bar that you have to cross. And I think that it's important to really understand your field well, and then just establish a reputation as an honest broker in this field. Because I think if you come out of the gate really aggressive about a particular viewpoint without kind of having that history of, well, I've heard this person speak on other topics and they were science-based and rational. I'm more likely to listen to that than someone that's just very opinionated. And I think a lot of people that work in the fields we work in, animal agriculture and genetics, we are dealing with quite controversial topics, and we need to be kind of aware that we're probably going to get accused of being industry shills. And it's always amusing to me because, there's certain things like the safety of genetically engineered products. Every major scientific society in the world has come to an opinion that there's no unique risks. That's science for safe. right? And so if I say that their products are safe, you don't really need to pay me to say that. I'm just basically saying what the scientific consensus on this topic says.
Right.
When I get a bit suspicious is when there's someone that's saying, nah, every single scientist in the world is wrong, I know what's right, they're unsafe.
That might be a red flag.
They're
right?
the ones that
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. And I think, unfortunately, I think the tobacco kind of situation where there were a group of, I think they were executives that got up in front of the Congress and said, we think smoking is safe or something. That often gets used as, if you speak up for a topic that agrees with industry, that you're some sort of a tobacco scientist. I think that's unfair when, in fact, what you're doing is actually saying what the scientific consensus says. I think that needs to be disassociated from when someone's saying something that doesn't agree with the scientific consensus. And they're totally allowed to do that. Like, that's how we make scientific discoveries. But if I'm saying they're unsafe, my bar of evidence is this high, because I am saying something that's absolutely counter to what the scientific consensus is, and there needs to be a very high bar of evidence in order to do that. And I think that the targeted misinformation campaign and the groups that are really pushing the narrative that it's unsafe have been quite hostile towards public sector scientists at the land-grant universities who are just basically saying what the scientific consensus is, because it does disrupt their marketing plan. Like, they need the public to be scared of this topic. Otherwise, you're not going to try and look for alternative products that have a butterfly label on them. And I think it's kind of a cynical marketing campaign. It's kind of genius, right? Buy my product that doesn't have something in it, and I'll charge you more for that nothing. It's pretty good marketing, but it only works if the public don't understand the science, and so it kind of is unfortunately in their interest to try and discredit public sector scientists who are trying to defend evidence base around this particular topic. And it's not just this topic, right? We live right now in a very unusual time in history in terms of not only the science around agriculture, but also the science around vaccines and medicine, for example. But I think, as public sector scientists, and especially agriculture, with 2% of the population being involved in ag and 98%, if we don't get this information out there and the science right, there's a very nasty history of when ideology has been allowed to drive agricultural production decisions, because ag science does not care what your political beliefs is. And so I look back to Lysenkoism in Russia, and that kind of resulted in the Holodomor, the giant famine in the Ukraine, the Great Leap Forward in China, where everyone was meant to work together on collective farms. That resulted in millions of deaths. And more recently, Sri Lanka has banned innovations, and basically the government was overthrown. So there is a long history of not using evidence and objective data to make the best agricultural production systems, and letting ideology and what's natural drive, or what's politically correct in the case of Lysenkoism, where he thought all the plants would cooperate together in some sort of a socialist fashion. That's not how science works, buddy. It actually has these real effects in terms of food security, and I don't want to live through the famines of the 70s again, but I fear if we don't allow useful innovations into our agricultural production systems, or we let ideology drive what's an acceptable production system, that we're going to unfortunately learn that lesson again, that actually to feed the population we do need to use science, and we do need to use objective data. And I think that's a cross I'll die on.
Well, I mean, we might just end it there, but I will ask, what do you hope your legacy is here at UC Davis?
I hope that it's the importance of actually translating our science to the general public, so not only to farmers. I almost feel like we've got them covered, and with the level of sophistication, I feel most farmers often know more than I do about some of the topics that I go to speak to them about. But actually taking it to the public and presenting it in a way that's digestible by the public. So don't give a scientific presentation to a general public audience, right? Be someone that connects with your audience, and work with filmmakers like the movie Food Evolution you alluded to earlier. That was a scientist working with a filmmaker. his expertise is narrative storytelling. Mine is science. And the two aren't necessarily married together, but if you collaborate together, you can produce information that's digestible to the general public, and you can actually get that out there. And that particular documentary, I think, is now on Hulu and several other deals. But I guess at the end of the day, my passion is we have to use objective, evidence-based information in our agricultural production systems. And I fear that we might be losing a little bit as scientists at the moment, and we need to change our communication style in order to get the same level of reach and influence that the social influencers get. Like, I don't think it's appropriate that, I don't know, someone like Food Babe has more influence than someone that's trained their entire life in these topics and knows the intricacies and the trade-offs that would be associated with a quote unquote, not having anything you can't pronounce in your food, I think is her claim to fame. And that's not a good metric on which to base your decisions. And I think that making that more palatable is really what I hope that the legacy might be, and that we can make better able to get the voice of science out there in a palatable way, that we can counter the misinformation and actually help the general public to understand what actually is a sustainable production system, and that their choices actually do matter, and that they need to have all the information to make an informed choice as to what the trade-offs might be with different production systems.
Yeah, it's all about knowledge. Knowledge is power, right? And just having folks kind of understand things a little bit and do a little research on their own to understand what labels mean and what all this means sometimes is crucial. I can't thank you enough for being here with us. I could talk to you all day, and thank you so much for everything you've done for animal agriculture and genetics, and the future is still bright. You'll still be doing all kinds of fun stuff.
I'll still be running around.
Yeah,
she'll
sure. Still be around. She'll be doing all kinds of fun, interesting stuff. So we'll keep following you, but we can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you, Alison.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. We'll see you again next time on Clear Conversations.